Liubov Velychko is a Ukrainian investigative journalist with over 15 years of experience uncovering corruption, crime, and human rights violations. She specializes in exposing disinformation campaigns and has conducted numerous investigations into Russian propaganda, revealing the networks behind its spread and dismantling the information operations orchestrated by Russian intelligence services. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please make sure you are subscribed so you don't miss out on any of our fantastic speakers. Please do also like this video. I know you'll want to once you get a few minutes into it. It really does help with the algorithm, and it helps new people discover the fantastic guests that we feature on the channel. Thank you also to everyone who is helping out with our current campaign, and that is to support our imminent trip to Ukraine, where we are going to be putting on events and we are going to be doing a lot of recording and interviews on the ground. So thank you to everyone who is supporting with that. Without further ado, let's get into the conversation. Lyubov, welcome to the channel.
Thank you. Hello. I'm very happy to share my knowledge with all of you.
I'm fascinated by the work you do, and probably it would require several conversations to unpack your experience in, covering topics of corruption, covering the topics of Russian disinformation. In this episode, we are going to be focusing on the myths and propaganda tropes that seem to be behind a lot of the questions that was recently posed to President Volodymyr Zelensky by Lex Friedman. Before we get into that, maybe you could say a few words about your work and your experience, because it is quite remarkable.
Um, sure. For more than 10 years, I'm investigating Russian disinformation campaigns in Ukraine and abroad. And I saw a lot of interesting stories and failed disinformation operations and very successful disinformation operations. And because I was investigating them in very detailed way. I had lots of threats from Russians and especially Russian special services as PSB. They were not happy about the work I was doing, so there are many threats and situations when I could die, but hopefully and successfully I'm still here. I'm in Ukraine, I'm in Kyiv, and I'm continuing my work. And so no matter how they will try to stop me, I will do my work, because I do believe that we need to resist this huge power of propaganda and disinformation, because wars starts from the informational wars. And if we will fail the informational war, we will have real troops on our land.
Well, let's start with one question that relates to journalism, because one of the myths and tropes that goes around, and this is especially effective, unfortunately, in the US amongst conservatives, is that Ukraine is not a democracy because elections have been suspended. And also, it's not a democracy because, the practice of journalism is suppressed and it's dominated by oligarchs and this kind of thing. It seems to me, at least, that the opposite is true, that the informational sphere in Ukraine is far freer than compared to, say, the Second World War in Britain, where there were very extensive press controls. But what's your impression as a practicing journalist? Do you consider Ukraine a vibrant democracy? And do you consider Ukrainian journalism to be still evolving and strong in time of war?
I've never felt so strong as I feel now being an investigative journalist. I never felt that I can be so influential like I am right now. And that is amazing for me to say and to feel, because I was investigating corruption during more than 15 years. And I saw how Ukraine was developing. I saw all the processes and I saw all the problems, and I was investigating many cases, and I saw the results of my investigations. And with every next year, I saw that the state power is more and more reacting on what I'm saying and what I'm doing. And that is for me the sign that media in Ukraine are really strong power, the real fourth power. And I cannot say that we have like such huge problems with corruption as we had a decade ago, because we really have lots of reforms. And they are not easy to make like in a very short period. This is a long period a story, but still this process is continuing. And I see that more and more NGOs and anti-corruption NGOs are involved in the process of anti-corruption reforms. So state power asks them what they need to fix, what problems they see, and they are reacting on those critics. And that is great. So Ukrainian medias and NGOs together, they represent the civil society will, and state power is very sensitive to that will, because the Ukrainians right now, they understand that they are fighting not only for their land, but for their right to choose. So Ukrainians decided not to be the part of the Russian, so-called Russian world, but to become a part of Europe and the civilized world, the Western world. And so because of that, we understand the values of Western world, and we want to be the part of these values. So that is why we are switching from Russia to West. And of course, Russia doesn't like it, and it will try to take us back. But no, we understand that Russia is our real enemy on all senses, not only because of the soldiers, but because they don't want us to develop our democracy. But we want this to be done.
The next topic, and this leads very well on from what you've just said there, what Russia says the invasion in 2014 was all about in Donbass was protecting Russian speakers. So could you talk to this myth that somehow the Russian language and Russian identity and culture are suppressed in Ukraine, and somehow this, gave Russia the excuse to invade?
Russian and Ukraine were enemies not for the last 10 years, but for hundreds of years. Russia wanted to make Ukrainians Russians for hundreds of years. And to do this, one of the things they did, they tried to delete Ukrainian language. They were forbidding it on all levels. Ukrainian language was forbidden at schools, universities. It was forbidden for writing books and for writing newspapers. And I'm talking not about last, like even 100 years. Russia was forbidden Ukrainian language more and more and more since I can't even say which year, which century, because it was forbidden for more than 263 times. We can fact check it, the concrete amount. So it was impossible to develop this language on the state level, on the level of educational system, but still Ukrainian language survived. And that is amazing that it survived in such circumstances, because for hundreds of years, Russians were killing intelligence in Ukraine. They were killing writers, they were killing politicians, they were killing all people who were trying to protect their identity, their Ukrainian identity, one of which is the right to talk Ukrainian language and to use it for writing books, for example. And that is why, for example, when I was studying at school in 90s, I felt that I am discriminated as a Ukrainian speaking person from the family where all members of family speaks Ukrainian, because of the Russian long-term propaganda. In our school, Russian language was like fashion cool language. And Ukrainian language, according even to Russian propaganda, is a language for people from village. From village means that this is a language for stupid people, not very well educated. So if you are speaking Ukrainian language, that says that you're not very smart. So if you want to be cool and if you want to be smart, you need to speak Russian language. No matter that after 1991, only one official language in Ukraine we had, Ukrainian. Even state government guys were talking Russian language on the press conferences. in official during official meetings. That is also looked very natural in the sphere where Russia had huge influence, but it was very strange for me personally, as from Ukrainian woman who understands that Russia is a separate state and it has no right to influence on us and to say what language we need to talk. But why so many Ukrainians were speaking Russian even before the full-scale invasion? It's not because they want it. It's not because this is very natural will, but because of a strategy of Russification of Ukraine during Soviet period, when, for example, in the city where I was grown in Vinnytsia, there were 40 schools in 1987, and only 4 schools were in Ukrainian. All other schools were Russian language speaking schools. So it means that all like mathematics, history, and all other subjects were studied in Russian language. So, of course, if you go to school and use Russian language there, and then when you start to go to university, and again, the same situation, most of universities were in Russia using the Russian language. So you continue to use Russian language in the university, and then you are going to the work, you naturally continue to speak Russian because for 15 years or more you were using Russian language every single day. And in result, you are starting to use Russian language in your private life and feeling that this is more comfortable for you to speak Russian language rather than speak Ukrainian language. So when then you have a family, you have kids, and you talk in Russian language with those kids. And then those kids are rising. And again, you have a Russian speaking family in Ukraine. So that is why we had a situation where so many people were speaking Russian, being Ukrainians. But after the full-scale invasion, according to the statistics, more than 75% of Ukrainians proclaim that their native language is Ukrainian language. And I think some of this amount are people who were speaking Russian but switched to Ukrainian language because they realize how important it is to save their identity. And we must remember about one very interesting phrase which was said by the Imperatrice of Russian Federation. It was not Federation, it was Empire, State Empire. She said that Russia ends only where Russian language ends. That is why Russians understand that they need to develop the Russian-speaking societies everywhere where they can, to claim that those are Russians, those are not like Ukrainians, so those are not Lithuanians, Estonians, those are our people. So we have the right to protect our people. You see, that is why we realized that we need to protect our Ukrainian language and Ukrainian culture in frames of Ukraine. And because this is the question which rises before the invasion on our country.
And let's turn to what is perhaps one of the most difficult questions. And 3 years into the war, I'm still sort of shocked and very disappointed when I hear this particular argument. And that is that you can divide Russians into good Russians and bad Russians. And that's a fairly sort of binary thing. But the only reason Russians don't oppose the war is because they have a lack of information or they have bad information. And if only they knew the truth, things would be very different. They'd all be out on the streets, etc. So can we address this myth? Because this is probably one of the more dangerous ones, I think, that's out there, because it does affect some Western decision making.
Let's make 2 answers about good and bad Russians and about freedom and access to the information. Saying frankly, on the first days of full-scale invasion, I was also believing in the myth that there are good and bad Russians, and because Russians don't know what is going on in Ukraine, they don't go to protest against the war. And that is why what I was doing, I was a part of volunteer movement, so-called informational army in Ukraine. There were more than 400,000 people involved in this group. And so what we're trying to do, we're trying to talk to Russians in their platforms, in social medias, and to share information about what is going on in Ukraine during this full-scale invasion, to give them that information, to say the truth, to give them the balance of information, to make them compare what their Kremlin TV channels are saying and what is really going on. So we were sharing this information where we could, on the social media platforms, on the websites where we had contacts. Even we put photos on the Google Maps on the very popular Russian places, like, for example, McDonald's or state administrations. We put photos of dead Russians because the official statement of Russia was that there are no dead Russians because of the war, that no losses, they were saying. So we are putting the photos of dead Russians on the Google Maps and show that there are people who are dead. You see, Russians are dying of this war. This is not true what Kremlin's stakeholders are saying. And we were doing this very, very massively. So can you imagine, like 400,000 of people who are sharing information? This is crazy amount. And let me remind you that so many people who are our relatives living in Russia right now. So we were trying to talk to our relatives who lived in Russia and our friends. We had plenty of friends with Russians because we are neighbors. And we were calling to them and saying what is going on around, and trying to tell them the truth. And after like nearly 2 months of very massive sharing information in that way, we understood that they don't want to listen to us. And that was so strange for us. Like, why, if you know, and if you know what is going on, why do not react like a normal person can react? Like, don't you want to change something? Do you really want to kill us, knowing all these horrible things that Russians already done in Ukraine, like having those plenty of videos and photos, all kind of evidences? Like, can't you see what is going on? Why you're not changing your opinion? And the answer on this question rise for me only like last year, when I was talking to one behaviorist and psychologist who explained me that people don't like to change their minds because it's their human's nature. If they created their own world, like having the massive information from propagandist TV channels, for example, for decades, so they created their own image of the world using those kinds of information. So it's not comfortable for their brain to ruin, to destroy all this picture of world that is in their brain. So they are pushing away all the information which doesn't fit the image of the world they already have in their head. And according to some like investigations of scientists, they say that to change the picture of world, you need the same amount of the time that this picture was creating. So, for example, if you were listening to Russian propaganda for 20 years, we need 20 years more to change this narrative. But what we need also, we need the will of the state to change this narrative. in Russia. So it means that if you're living in Moscow and if you will only read the alternative news and BBC, it doesn't mean that in 20 years you will change your mind. You also need to be in the society, which also has the same will. But I don't believe that it is possible in Russia in the nearest perspective or wherever. That is why I know that we will have a lot of, we will need to spend a lot of time to make the reintegration of the occupied territories, especially in Crimea and Donbass, because for 10 years they were living in the Russian informational bubble. And so we will need to make a huge effort to change this picture of the world in their brain. And so let's again see clear. In Russia, you can use VPN to read any news you want. There is no problem to go to whatever site in the world and to get the information. So you have free access to everything. The same in social media. You can go to any groups of like Ukrainians or any news, any group of news agency in the world, and to see what they are writing about the situation in Russia. You can again read the news from so-called opposite, like how to say,
oppositional media. And actually, there are plenty of sources in Russian language by Ukrainian journalists broadcasting in Russian. Vitaly Portnikov, Dmitry Gordon, and there are many others who are broadcasting in Russian. So that material's there. And there are, as you say, there are a handful of Russian journalists who are, I would say, providing reasonable information to get a reasonable view of reality. Someone like Michael Naki, for instance, Plushev, and a small number of others. That information is there. So it's not that there's an absence of information. If Russians really wanted to find it, it's as you say, it's easily accessible in the Russian language.
Yes, there's so many resources for information that you can know everything, what is going on, but they just don't want to read the picture of the world. And let's continue with the so-called good and bad Russians. So let's ask ourselves, if we are saying that this Russian is good, what do we mean? Do we mean that he is good because he doesn't kill Ukrainians with the weapon? He is not a soldier. For me, it's not an argument to say that he is good. Because if you are not doing anything to stop the war, if you are not saying loudly that you are not agree, it doesn't mean that you are good. I like some philosophers say that the most dangerous and horrible people are those who are just keep silent, who are not doing anything. They don't even try. And that is why, as a Ukrainian who saw the Euromaidan, where people were fighting against people with weapon, with the police with weapon, I saw how brave they are because they wanted to fight the dictator regime. It was not a matter that thousands of activists during the Euromaidan revolutions were imprisoned. It didn't stop the other wave of activists which came back to the street. So it took many months of every single day protests to stop the dictator regime. The protests in Russia, they continue in just for few days. And after activists are in prison, everything keeps silent. Everything stops. It shows a huge difference between Ukrainian activists and Russian activists. Ukrainian activists understand that they they need to fight until the victory. There is no way to stop because of being in jail or being beaten or even being killed. After more than 100 Ukrainians were killed on Euromaidan during just few days, protests didn't stop. Protests became even harder because people understood that if they will stop right now, they again will be there will be more and more pressure from the dictator regime on the all Ukrainian society. That is why Yanukovych escaped and ran away to Moscow, to Russia, because he saw that those people are crazy. They will not stop. There is no way to be a leader for such people. In Russia, the Russian state administration see that people are not ready to fight for their rights. That is why day by day they are making their regime stronger and stronger, and people are not reacting on these repressions anymore. They feel and they think that they are weak, they are not strong enough, and they are forgetting that in Russia there are more than 100 million people, and it's a much more a bigger amount, that amount of even policemen and people with a weapon. It's impossible to stop 100 million people having 1 million of policemen. In general, they have nearly 100 million policemen. So even though like ordinary people do not have weapons, you cannot put in jail 100 million of people. There are not enough place for it. But Russian society doesn't want to realize this. They say that state power needs to decide what to do. They are smarter, they are stronger. This is not our thing to decide, to fight or not to fight, to go and to kill Ukrainians or not to kill Ukrainians. And because most of the society supports the war against Ukraine, according to the statistics, it's more than 70% people in Russia are supporting the war, the idea of war. And the rest, 30%, they just keep silent or just don't do enough to stop this horrible, terrible war. That is why, for me personally, there are no good Russians. The only one good Russians, one good Russians are those who are really fighting with a weapon on the side of Ukrainian army. Yes, those Russians are good for me. The rest, no. If the Russian go and say that he is in opposition, I, as a researcher of disinformation, can hear what he's saying and how he is saying, and I never saw in my life, and I never hear in my life any single Russian oppositioner who was not copy pasting the Kremlin narratives in his speeches. And that is very strange, you know. That is why, for me, even people who are saying that they are against Kremlin regime, but still they have the narratives of Kremlin regime. That is why, for me, they are not the good Russians.
That's an interesting point, isn't it? Because there's only one or two who do not systematically reproduce those that I've heard. I mean, Michael Naki is one who will rarely, if ever, reproduce those narratives. Garry Kasparov, mostly quite good. But then you have someone like Yulia Latinina or Yulia Navalny. And of course, they are labeled as Russian oppositionists. But if you go through their Twitter feed, if you go through their speeches line by line, you will find a lot of highly problematic comments, a lot of highly problematic reposts, not just of clear Russian propaganda narratives, but I saw Yulia Latinina, who is supposedly pro-Ukrainian, reposting absolute propagandists, not just people who are falling into the mythology, but clear, agents of Kremlin influence. It's bizarre.
Are also serving to Kremlin regime, seeing and hearing what they are saying and what they are posting. I see this again, things from the very Kremlin ideas of big Russia with these imperialistic ideas. They are trying to hide this very accurate way. So I can see this because I'm Ukrainian who was studying Ukrainian history at school in the university and during all my life. And I see how they are trying to hide that they are really happy that Russia becomes great again in their vision because it invades other countries and grabs the territories which doesn't belong to the state. And this imperialistic view, um, it's in the Russian soul, they want to seem very modern, very opposite, to look cool for you, for Western audience. But for me, as a person who knows history of relations between Russia and Ukraine, their narratives are not suited to pro-Ukrainian narratives at all. They are not saying that Ukraine needs to protect its sovereign territories with no way to give the Crimea, to give any territory to Russia. They are still insisting on like russification of Ukrainians. They are saying that language doesn't matter, which again, as I told you before, really matters for Russian, because for them this is a strong argument to protect the Russian-speaking people who they think are Russians.
I'd have to say, I mean, Kasparov is perhaps unique in that he explicitly says Russia must lose and everything must be done to make Russia lose. Now, that's the position of every single Ukrainian, I think, who's sensible. But you almost never, well, you actually never hear that from the majority of oppositionists. They might say, oh, the war has to stop, but they will never say Russia must lose, which I think is a crucial test.
But let me remind that Russia must lose, but for Ukrainians, Russia must lose and to be cutted into different federations. Then, only then, Russia will be safe for the rest of the world. Russian Federation is federation because it consists of different nations, different like countries, with their own language, cultures, history, and stuff like this. But they were violated by the Moscow in one or the second period of the history and became the part of bigger empire. And Russia will continue to be aggressive to the rest of the world until it will be Russian Federation. That is why when Ukrainians see some tries of revolutions in these republics, we really want them to be free because they are like Ukrainians in that sense. They have their own nationality, their own culture. They are not Russians. They even don't like Russians, the average way we used to imagine Russians, but they don't have enough of weapon, they don't have enough of people, so that is why they're even in the worse situation than Ukraine is, comparing the amount of people who are living there. That is why it's not enough for us to hear that Russia must lose. Russia must lose and to become weak, and it needs to become weak only if it will be separated to different parts.
And this leads very well on to the next question, which is that as long as Russia remains an imperial entity, is there any sense in which it can be negotiated with using, economic rationality and the sort of logic that you would get from Western diplomats, Western politicians who are answerable to their populations. Is there any sense in which negotiations and indeed a treaty can be at all binding as long as Russia carries on being the sort of empire that it clearly aspires to become once again?
The short answer is no. I will explain why. Even before the full-scale invasion, if you will look at the economical situation in Russia and how people, average people, were living in Russian cities and villages, you will see the catastrophe on the streets. You will see in what a horrible circumstances people are living. Because of the corruption and because of the poverty, it had no sense to start the war because war is a very expensive stuff. If you have such a big amount of problems on the ground in your villages and cities, you need to think about investments on this cities and towns and on the roads and on the gasification and modernization of all spheres of like living standards in your own country. So logically, economically, logically, it was no sense to start the full-scale invasion. But even on the beginning, realizing the amount of these problems on the ground in the economical sphere, it didn't stop the Kremlin regime from the idea to spend money not on the development of the economy, but on the weapon to kill Ukrainians. And after the sanctions have started against Russia, it again hurt a lot average people and economy of Russia. But Russia didn't want it to stop the war because of the sanctions. It found another ways to avoid sanctions, using, for example, Turkey or Kazakhstan or China to buy more and more weapon and to spend more and more money for the weapon, no matter that economical situation became worse and worse and worse. So during almost 3 years, Russia was ignoring these economical losses for her people and her state, and was continuing the war. And it shows that Russians really doesn't think about the economical situation. They more think about the geopolitical interests, which is to grab as much territories as possible, no matter how much money you need to spend on it. And recently, Putin, during the press conference, said a very funny thing, funny for him, of course. He said, you know why we're making the war? Because why we started the war? Because it felt so boring. Our people, they want this action. They want this action. Use this word action. We need actions because we felt boring living in our cities and villages. That is why to make this action, we started the war. And there was a laugh in the place where he was talking like, yes, yes, we agree. Like for Ukrainians, and I think for you also as a person from with democratical views, it sounds ridiculous. Like if you don't have enough money to eat, to live normally, you don't need actions to make your life better and funnier. You want to live more successfully. You want to earn more money. Uh, but in reality of Russia, no, they want to grab more territories. They want to invade. They want to show the power, how powerful they are, and how great is the Russian army. This is the ideology of militarization is so deeply in their souls. They don't want to listen any economical arguments to stop them. That is why I don't believe that any economical negotiations will be a strong argument for Russians to stop the war.
And that leads on to probably one of the most absurd questions or absurd myths in all of this. And yet again, it is fundamental to Western policies. Um, and unfortunately, there seems to be a lot of delusion around this one in Washington and Berlin. And that is that Putin wants peace, Putin needs peace. I don't think either of those things are true. There's little evidence that they are true. What do you and Ukrainians think of that?
We don't believe in this because, first of all, Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, forgetting about the Budapest Memorandum, where this country was guaranteeing safety for our state. And this guarantee was our friend, best friend of Ukraine, invaded and took away Crimea and took away and used its tanks and soldiers and weapons on Donbass to grab our territory. It doesn't fit to the myth that Putin or Russians want peace. During 8 years, since 2014, Ukraine tried to make a peaceful agreement, like so-called Minsk agreement with Russia. I even forgot that there were 8 or more agreements written down, saying that okay, we stop the fire, we are like freezing the line on Donbass, and these agreements, they were nothing. It was just a piece of paper. After every single agreement, Russians continued to kill Ukrainians. They were not trying to make peace. And Putin was the leader of the country during this period of time. And again, after 3 years, almost 3 years of full-scale invasion, when 800 of thousand of Russian loses, it is not an argument for Putin to stop. They are even on their state propagandist channels. They are saying, and they were saying always, that Ukraine needs to be the part of Russia. All Ukrainian territory needs to be the part of Russia, not only Donbass, not only Crimea. They don't think that Ukraine has the right to be independent state. That is why they will never stop until they will grab all Ukrainian territory under their control. And you need to understand that when Putin says, I want peace, it translates as, I need some time to get more weapons, to make my army a little bit bigger and stronger, to attack again, to grab more territories. Because yes, really, war is not the cheapest thing in the world, and it's not the easiest thing in the world. That is why I didn't expect that Ukrainians will resist us so much. That is why, okay, I need more time so I can spread the idea that I need peace. But Budapest Memorandum and Minsk Agreement shows that if even Putin will sign the peaceful agreement, it will break it in few days or few weeks or few months. This what history shows us. That is why we have no illusions about so-called peace from Putin. If we will let him, give him more time to collect more weapons and more soldiers, he will come back and he will grab more and more Ukrainian territories, and he will kill more Ukrainians.
The other myth, and I think this is again a very important one, Lex Friedman, maybe the most interesting thing he said was that he doesn't see Zelensky as a puppet. He sees him as someone with agency and independence. And that was kind of interesting statement that he made. But It is one of the myths that is highly prevalent, and of course Russia plays on this. That actually oligarchs pull all the strings, or the U.S. Zelensky is a puppet of the U.S. foreign policy, etc., etc. That Maidan was a CIA coup. I mean, you know how those myths kind of go. How would you address this idea that Zelensky is perhaps the least restricted by the power of oligarchs of any of Ukraine's post-independence leaders?
During the election when Zelensky won, Ukrainian society thought that Zelensky is a puppet of oligarch Kolomoisky. We like for us it was like 100% information. And what do we have now? Where is Kolomoisky now? Kolomoisky is not only oligarch anymore. He's he's under arrest. So Zelensky did a lot of stuff to make Ukrainian state power less dependent from oligarchs than anyone before. And Zelensky is a type of person who doesn't like to be manipulated. He is a comedian, an actor, and he is a psychological type that then he wants to decide what to do, not what others means like leaders from the world or others will tell him to do, but he wants to be good for his people, for Ukrainians. That is why he is so sensitive to critics of journalists, especially in Ukraine. He wants to show that he is cool, he is good, he is the best president in the history of Ukraine. That is why he do his best to show that it is true, not only to make the fake picture, but even to prove it. That is why, as I told before, reforms are continuing even during the war, and we have a freedom of speech during the war. And of course, it's there are some things that we cannot say about the positions of Ukrainian army, and it is obviously why we are not saying this. But in other things, as an investigative journalist, I can criticize president, I can criticize government, I can make my investigations, and I feel absolutely free, and I don't feel any threat because of my activities. The only one threat can be only from Russians, from their special agencies, because again, I'm investigating Russian disinformation and Russian activities during many years. But in Ukraine, I feel totally safe working as an investigative journalist. I think Russians right now, Russian people might jealous to Ukrainians because in Russia, oligarchs are real power. But in Ukraine, we made a lot of efforts to stop them controlling all spheres of life. We had lots of official like steps for this. When Zelensky came, he made all to stop the power of oligarchs, which was in Ukraine before he came. So that is why right now oligarchs cannot control, for example, TV channels or other media outlets in Ukraine, being oligarchs. That is really great, again, for freedom of speech in Ukraine. And there are many, many more steps of which we can talk for many hours. But the clue point is that right now I feel and I see as a journalist and as a citizen of Ukraine that Ukrainian society is fighting not only on the battlefield, but we are fighting for our real independence in all spheres of our lives.
This next question might be one of the easiest to answer because it seems like one of the most absurd. And yet, I do hear this a lot, especially on this sort of more left or extreme left side, and perhaps those who would have been sympathetic to the Soviet Union and its cause prior to the fall of the Berlin Wall. And this is that we should be concerned for Russian security. I think the way Lex Friedman put the question is, how can Ukraine guarantee Russian security? I mean, it just even saying the words, it seems utterly absurd. But yeah, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that one.
Russian security is a fake argument to invade our countries, other countries. Uh, just let's look at the facts. Which country was aggressive to Russia in a military way after the Second World War? Were there any actions on the Russian border from anyone in the world? Let's just go to the news and read. Zero. And then let's see how many times Russian troops were illegally invading other territories after the Soviet Union was destroyed. Let's remember about Transnistria, the territory of Moldova, who is right now under control of Russian troops because, again, of the claims that they want to be independent from Moldova, and there are other like nation. It's like it's not true, and it's this model was used later in Donbass, saying that this is other people with other culture. They have the right to be independent. And why Russia did this with Donbass after Prидnestrovia, and why? Because Russia saw that world doesn't react. World try to ignore this. World just saying, "Oh yes, this is bad," but what can we do? We can do nothing. And so Russia continued. In 2008, Russian troops invaded Georgia. Georgia was not the part of any military alliance in the world. Georgia is a small country with 4 million of people surrounded by Russia, like almost everywhere from all the territories. Like comparing even the size of Georgia and Russia, it's like less than 1%. And Russia invaded Georgia. There were no threats for Russian securities from Georgia, but it didn't stop Russia from the idea to invade Georgia. And that is why we need to remember these examples. Russia will continue to invade other countries because it just can. The only one reason it invades is only because it can. It has enough of weapons and soldiers, and Russia sees that no one in the world, no country, no alliance has the power to stop it. At least they didn't show that they can stop it. There were no threats from any country in the world to Russia, but Russia still invades other countries. So I liked that answering this question, Zelensky used the word bullshit. I'm just trying to be even more diplomatic than he, but this word, a bullshit, is a very short answer to the myth that Russia afraid about its security. Russia has a nuclear weapon. Russia has a huge army. Russia has a huge militarized economy and a huge amount of factories which can build more and more tanks to kill and to invade other countries. And even though it was invading so many times other countries, even after the 1990s, no one in the world attacked Russia except of Ukraine, of course, in Kursk. But I hope you understand why we are doing this, because we see no way to use to come back our territories, but to change Russian territories to Ukrainian territories. That is why we had no way not to do this. But
And no intention to keep the territories, of course. I think that
yes,
is absolutely a
yes.
critical point there. Ukraine is not an imperialist power with no desire to become one either. we're almost approaching the end. We've got sort of just two more questions. I think they're relatively short ones, I expect as well. And one is something that I really sort of struggle with. And this was Lex Friedman coming up with these suggestions of how Russian security could be improved or reassured. For instance, he said that what if Russia was in NATO, which seems to be an extraordinary sort of question when it seems that Russia is intent on destroying NATO and pulling it apart. The other idea he came up with is that, well, what if Ukraine was to have strong trade relationships with India, Global South, etc.? That would give it some form of security. Seems to me that evidence shows that neither of these are sensible and that reality, doesn't play out in this way at all. India is now one of, if not the largest purchaser of Russian oil or hydrocarbons. And despite being democracy, it seems that it has no common cause or sympathy with Ukraine, which is a democracy. So why might Lex bring these particular odd ideas up?
It seems to me that Lex lives in a parallel world, saying frankly. Some things that he's saying doesn't fit to the reality at all. Okay, if Ukraine will make stronger connections with India and Africa, trade relations, doesn't mean that Ukrainian army will be stronger. I don't think so. Does it mean that India will give its weapon to Ukraine? No, because India, if we will look for its statements for many years, India likes to be a neutral country. It doesn't like to take part in any war, in any wars. So, and what can we get from Africa to become stronger as a country to if Russia will attack us again? Like what? Like, okay, we have trade big amount of goods we are giving them and selling them, and so what? They cannot give us more weapons. They will not fight for us. I don't believe in this. So no Africa, no India, no trade relationships will make us stronger in a military way. It will only give us more like money, but again, we need to spend those money for making our tanks and stuff like this, or weapon types to strengthen our military machine. But it will not help us in the way that NATO can help to Ukraine if Ukraine will become a member of NATO. And the point that Russia can become a member of NATO sounds super ridiculous because, as I remember, to become a member of NATO, you need to fit some kinds of criteria, and some of those criteria are this needs to be a democratic country and who respects the international law. And I don't think that Russia fits to these types of criteria. And I even right now will not explain why. You obviously understand. That is why no, these ideas never will help. And really, I don't understand why Lex is so naive even to proposing this crazy ideas to Ukrainian president during the interview. And if you will look at the emotions of Zelensky, on the expression of his face, even without the translation, you will see that he thinks the same that I'm saying right now. He was shocked, to
I
be
was going to
honest.
say the look on his face is like, what have I agreed to? Who is this guy, and where on earth do these questions come from? And there's definite shock on his face. Uh-huh. And the last question, and the one that I found most troubling from Lex, and of course it talks to the fact that he's almost certainly in some kind of bubble, some kind of weird mythologized kind of bubble, and not just purely of his. He almost certainly interacts with other people who share some of these points of view. So that's troubling. And the last one is about redemption and forgiveness. And he came back to this so many times, you know, is it possible for Ukraine and Ukrainians to forgive not just Russian and Russians and good Russians and bad Russians, but Vladimir Vladimirovich as well. He even said, can you find it in your heart to forgive Putin? I mean, it's not just a naive question. At this point, I found that question actually obscene and insulting and actually disgusting because it's a form of almost psychological abuse for Ukraine, which is undergoing extreme trauma. But I don't know what you think of this one. I mean, it's such a weird and unpleasant thought at this point, and so detached from reality.
Uh, personally, me, personally, me, I think most of Ukrainians will answer the same, that we will never forgive Russians, because this is not the first generation of Ukrainians, my generation, who is struggling because of what Russia did with us. Even my grandmother was struggling because of the USSR Russian regime. When I'm saying USSR regime, I say as Russian regime because leaders of USSR were Russians. So they were making a genocide of Ukrainians in 1933, and she was a kid when she was trying to find some food, not to die. And other generation were struggling again, were killed because of repressions of Stalin. And again, Russian was our enemy in all senses, trying to kill our identity for decades and for hundreds of years. And now I'm saying that will not forgive Russians. It means I will not forgive Russians not only for this war, but for all the previous horrible things which they did with me, with my family members, and with my nation. We struggled so many years and so hard that this pain is just living in us. And it just like protectional functions of the human being. Be aware of the nation who kills you and who threats you for hundreds of years. Be aware of those people. Don't make friends with them. You cannot trust those people. I understand that in some day, of course, I hope the peace will come back on our territories, and we will reintegrate those territories and do our best to rebuild our country. But of course, we will we will always feel um the pain and the hate, and even not to say it hate, but the feeling of not trust to Russians. And it doesn't matter what they will say, and it doesn't matter that maybe they will pay reparations about this. By the way, I don't believe about the reparations. The only one thing that we can get from Russia is the some property that Russians oligarchs have abroad. So even if they will ask us to forgive them, we will still always remember that they are very cruel and they were so for hundreds of years. And their views on Ukraine and Ukrainians as on like little people, um, they will always be the same. That is why, no, we will never forgive them.
Well, we've reached the end. I think we've covered a lot of those myths. I think it's very important to do so. And I think your answers are a really important sort of addition to what Zelensky said. And if people watch both of these conversations, I think they'll have a much greater understanding of the mechanics of Russian myths and propaganda and how to counter them. But for now, thanks so much for coming onto the channel.
Thank you very much for invitation.